everything. You couldn't just make something happen. You had to go and create it.
At 78 years old, Barry Gibb, the last surviving member of the Bee Gees, has finally begun speaking openly about the one subject he spent decades avoiding, the haunting final days of his youngest brother, Andy. For years, fans whispered theories. Some said Andy was on the verge of a comeback. Others claimed he was pushed away by his own family. A few insisted the truth was darker still. That fame itself had chewed him up and spit him out before he ever had a chance to grow old. Barry has carried those questions like a shadow. Through interviews, tributes, and long silences, he kept the details private. But now, with time having softened his words, he has chosen to confirm what really happened, what Andy faced, what the family tried, and what was left unsaid until now. This isn't just a story about music. It's about love, ambition, and the quiet destruction of a life that shone too brightly, too soon. Join us as we reveal what really happened and what it means. Long before flashing disco balls, platinum records, and tabloid headlines, the Gibb family lived a modest, working-class life. Picture the post-war streets of Douglas on the Isle of Man, where Barry was born in 1946. The salt air from the Irish Sea carried through narrow streets lined with stone cottages. Inside one of those homes, Hugh Gibb and Barbara Gibb raised their children with music as a constant presence. Barry, the eldest son, learned early how to fill silence with melody. His guitar was more than wooden strings. It was a lifeline. In the evenings, when the coal fire crackled and neighbors lingered outside with cups of tea, Barry would hum tunes that hinted at a future far away from the Isle. Then came the moves, first to Manchester, where the boys discovered the raw energy of skiffle and early rock and roll, and then farther still, to Redcliffe, Queensland, Australia. It was a sun-drenched migration, one that would give the Gibb brothers the confidence to believe they weren't just small-town boys, but musicians destined to cross oceans. Andy was born in March 1958, the baby of the family. By then, Barry and his younger twin brothers, Robin and Maurice, were already experimenting with harmony, practicing until the sound of three voices blended so tightly you couldn't hear where one ended and the other began. Andy grew up watching this. For him, music wasn't just an interest, it was the family language. At the dinner table, Barbara reminded her children of two values: work hard and look out for one another. Hugh, who once played drums professionally, reinforced discipline. He reminded Barry especially that the spotlight was a privilege, never a guarantee. But here's where it gets complicated. Those lessons of loyalty and discipline would later be tested in ways no one could have predicted. What started in the warm air of Queensland would eventually collide with the pressures of fame, television contracts, and public rumor. By the late 1960s, Barry and the twins had made their move back to England, chasing a record deal and finding it in the form of producer Robert Stigwood. The Bee Gees were born, literally named after brothers Gibb, and their harmonies soon climbed the charts. Songs like To Love Somebody and Massachusetts proved they weren't just a novelty sibling act. They had staying power, and in the background was Andy. 10 years younger than Barry, he was a wide-eyed teenager as the Bee Gees were becoming international stars. While his older brothers were experimenting with lush ballads and psychedelic pop, Andy was still learning guitar chords and dreaming about writing songs that mattered. Andy's breakthrough came in the mid-1970s. After a short stint living in Australia, he returned to England where Barry introduced him to connections in the industry. Barry, by now an established writer and producer, recognized Andy's natural charisma. He had a voice that was smooth, youthful, and disarming. Unlike the falsetto-driven sound that would define the Bee Gees' disco era, Andy's tone was romantic and pure, tailor-made for the late 1970s soft rock charts. The scene that fans often remember is Andy stepping into the studio to record I Just Want to Be Your Everything, a song written by Barry. Imagine the atmosphere, cigarette smoke hanging low, the soft glow of studio lamps bouncing off reel-to-reel tape machines, Barry behind the glass giving nods of encouragement. Andy's voice, gentle yet commanding, took flight. The track went straight to #1 in the United States in 1977, launching Andy from the youngest Gibb into a global heartthrob seemingly overnight. The momentum didn't stop. With hits like Love is Thicker Than Water and Shadow Dancing, Andy became the first solo artist in history to have his first 3 singles hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Crowds of screaming fans followed him from Los Angeles to London. Photographers camped outside hotel lobbies. Record executives whispered about him as the new face of pop. But here's the truth. Andy was barely 20 years old. He hadn't lived enough life to shield himself from the darker sides of sudden fame. While his brothers had climbed gradually, with years of trial and error behind them, Andy had been catapulted into stardom as though shot from a cannon. Now, if you're wondering what made him stand out beyond his looks and famous last name, the answer is simple. Andy had vulnerability. He sang love songs as though he believed every word. He didn't hide behind irony or pretense. When he performed, audiences felt he was singing directly to them, confessing something fragile and urgent. It was this vulnerability that set him apart, and, tragically, it was also what left him exposed. And that's when everything changed. Because while Andy's career skyrocketed, so did the pressures. Reportedly, he began missing shows, turning up late, or arriving unprepared. Behind the polished smile and charm, there were whispers of exhaustion, loneliness, and reliance on substances to numb the edges of fame. Rumors spread faster than facts, and tabloids seized every stumble as evidence of a collapse in progress. Through it all, Barry watched from a distance. As the eldest brother, he was torn between pride in Andy's talent and fear of the dangers circling him. For Barry, the spotlight had always been both blessing and curse. He knew its seductive pull, its brutal cost. He recognized in Andy's wide grin and restless energy the same hunger that had driven him decades earlier, but now magnified under harsher lights, in an era of celebrity gossip and relentless touring schedules. This was the path to the spotlight for Andy Gibb. Dazzling, meteoric, but fragile. A young man who seemed to have everything, yet carried within him the seeds of struggle that would shape the rumors Barry would later confirm. When people think of Andy Gibb, they often recall the posters. A young man with feathered hair, a smile that seemed to promise eternal summer. But beneath the image, there was work, real work, that often went unnoticed. Recording an album in the late 1970s was no small feat. The analog studios of the era demanded patience and precision. Magnetic tape hissed with every roll. Engineers leaned over mixing boards the size of dinner tables, marking edits with grease pencils. Every vocal had to be captured in real time, with no digital patchwork to disguise imperfections. Andy approached that process with a natural fluency. He had what musicians call mic presence, an ability to step into the booth and make a song feel lived in on the first take. His phrasing was fluid, his high notes effortless, his delivery almost conversational. For producers, that was gold. But here's where it gets complicated. The very thing that made Andy's voice special, its openness, its emotional nakedness, was also the hardest to sustain. While Barry, Robin, and Maurice built their careers on harmony, Andy carried the full weight of expectation as a soloist. Every lyric rested on his shoulders, every performance was his alone to deliver. For viewers and listeners, that was intoxicating. Andy didn't just sing, he confessed. On stage, he would lean into a lyric with closed eyes, as though replaying a memory only he could see. Fans felt drawn in, as if they had been given a glimpse of something intimate. And yet, the hours were grueling. Tours stretched across continents. Interviews began before dawn and ended after midnight. The craft of being a pop star wasn't just about singing. It was about enduring. Andy's craft, therefore, was less about technical perfection and more about stamina. Could he summon the same sincerity night after night, city after city, while cameras and critics watched every move? That was the unspoken burden behind the glamour, and in Andy's case it set the stage for the rumors that have never quite gone away. If there is one chapter in Andy Gibb's story that has lingered longer than his chart-topping hits, it is the swirl of rumors that surrounded his final years. For decades, fans have asked, what really happened? Why did such a promising life unravel so quickly? And did his brothers, particularly Barry, do everything they could? To understand what Barry finally confirmed at 78, we need to sift through the clusters of speculation that grew around Andy's life, health, family tension, and career decline. Perhaps the most persistent rumor is that Andy's struggles with addiction defined his downfall. Reports from the late 1970s and early 1980s frequently mentioned missed shows, sudden cancellations, and erratic behavior. Tabloids framed these incidents as evidence of a young star spiraling out of control. According to some accounts, Andy himself admitted to dabbling with substances as a way to cope with fame's relentless pace. Friends reportedly described nights that blurred into mornings, hotel suites crowded with hangers-on, and a schedule that left little room for stability. But here's where the public often missed the nuance. Barry has since explained that while Andy did battle dependency issues, it was not the sole reason for his decline. He wasn't an addict in the sense people wanted to label him, Barry reflected in one interview. He was fragile. He carried a lot of emotional weight. The truth, as Barry confirmed, was that Andy's health was more complicated than the headlines suggested. By the early 1980s, Andy's heart was under strain, not solely from substances, but from exhaustion and anxiety. It was a body pushed too far, too young. Another painful rumor claimed that Andy had been ostracized by his own brothers, cast aside just as his career faltered. Fans pointed to moments when Andy seemed absent from Bee Gees projects or major public appearances. Whispers grew. Had the Bee Gees abandoned him? Now, if you're wondering if there was truth to that, Barry has addressed it directly. The reality, he explained, was heartbreaking in its simplicity. The family did pull back at times, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. We couldn't enable him, Barry has said. We loved him too much to let him self-destruct in front of us. According to longtime friends of the family, the Gibbs staged multiple interventions. They offered Andy places to stay, support systems, and even career opportunities. Barry, in particular, tried to involve Andy in songwriting projects, hoping that creative focus might anchor him. But Andy often resisted, torn between gratitude and resentment. The rumor of a rift therefore oversimplifies the truth. The brothers were desperate to help, but Andy's struggles created distance, the kind that no public performance could disguise. The third cluster centered on Andy's career. Fans wondered, did his decline begin because his music fell, out of style, or did his personal troubles tank his professional chances? The answer, Barry explained, is both. By the early 1980s, disco had become a cultural punchline. Radio stations shifted, record sales slowed, and artists once celebrated for their glossy production suddenly found themselves mocked. For Andy, whose sound was deeply tied to the late 70s moment, the backlash was brutal. And yet it wasn't just timing. Reportedly, Andy's reliability had become a concern for promoters and managers. Stories of missed rehearsals or last-minute withdrawals circulated. Some industry insiders quietly decided he was too risky to invest in. Barry has admitted that this was perhaps the hardest truth to face. Andy's immense talent was overshadowed by doubts about whether he could show up. He wanted it so badly, Barry said, but wanting wasn't always enough. And then there were the darkest rumors, the ones about Andy's final days in March 1988. Some fans insisted that his death at just 30 years old was a direct result of drugs. Others speculated about intentional self-destruction. Barry, with age and distance, has clarified this painful chapter. Andy's death, he explained, was caused by myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle. While his earlier lifestyle may have weakened his body, the official cause was not an overdose. In confirming this, Barry gave Andy something the tabloids never did: dignity. "He died of a broken heart," Barry once said softly, pointing not just to medical terminology but to the emotional reality of his brother's fragile state. It is a sentence that has echoed in the hearts of fans ever since. So what do we make of these rumors? Yes, Andy battled with substances. Yes, there was distance within the family at times. Yes, his career faltered under pressures both cultural and personal. And yes, his health ultimately failed him. But what Barry confirmed at 78 is that no single rumor captures the whole truth. Andy's story was not about scandal. It was about fragility. It was about a young man who soared faster than anyone expected, only to find that his wings were not strong enough to carry the weight of expectation. And that remains the line between myth and reality. What's actually confirmed is that Andy died of myocarditis at just 30 after years of struggle. What remains unknown is the inner storm he carried, the loneliness only he could truly measure. For Barry, that is the heartbreak of confirmation, not in feeding gossip, but in revealing that sometimes the truth is even sadder than the rumors. There are moments in every story when the trajectory changes so sharply it feels like the air itself has shifted. For Andy Gibb, that moment came in the early 1980s, when his career, once unstoppable, began to unravel in full view of the public. The setting was Los Angeles, 1981. Andy had been given a prime opportunity, a hosting role on the American television series Solid Gold. It was the kind of mainstream exposure that promised to cement his status beyond the pop charts, opening doors to acting and a wider entertainment career. Producers had high hopes. The cameras were polished, the stage lights burned hot, and the script was tight. But here's where it gets complicated. Behind the glossy exterior, Andy was struggling. He arrived late to rehearsals. His once flawless voice sometimes wavered, betraying exhaustion. On one infamous taping day, crew members whispered that Andy seemed unsteady, his focus darting in and out. The audience clapped dutifully, but insiders sensed the fragility beneath the smile. By mid-season, the decision was made. Andy would be replaced. Official statements cited creative differences, but the truth, according to those close to production, was more painful. He simply could not sustain the pressure. What should have been a turning point toward broader success became instead the beginning of retreat. Now, if you're wondering how Barry and the family responded, the answer reveals the depth of their bond. Barry, Robin, and Maurice rallied around him. They urged him to step back, to find healing away from the spotlight. He needed time, Barry later explained. The world wanted him to keep performing, but what he really needed was to rest. And that's when everything changed. Andy began withdrawing from the high-speed orbit of fame. Though he continued to record and perform intermittently, the opportunities grew fewer. Rumors swelled, but in private, the family clung to hope. There were periods of light, moments when Andy seemed ready to return, his voice strong, his optimism rekindled. Fans recall a brief Las Vegas residency where, for a few shining nights, it felt as though the old Andy was back. But the cycles were relentless. With each comeback attempt came renewed pressure, and with each stumble the shadow of doubt grew larger. In 1987, Andy moved back in with his mother Barbara in England. The plan was simple: to rebuild from the ground up, surrounded by family. But even then, his health was faltering. March 1988 became the final turning point. Andy was admitted to the hospital, his body weakened by years of strain. He spoke of projects still unfinished, songs yet to be recorded. But the heart that had carried so much emotion could no longer carry the load. At just 30 years old, Andy Gibb passed away. For Barry, it was shattering. He later confessed that losing Andy felt like losing a child, not just a brother. The turning point wasn't only Andy's, it was Barry's too. From that moment forward, every Bee Gees performance carried the ghost of the youngest Gibb. Beyond the stage lights and rumors, Andy Gibb was, at his core, a young man searching for normalcy. Those who knew him personally often describe a striking contrast: the superstar who sang to thousands, and the quiet soul who craved a simple life away from cameras. At home, Andy had rituals. He enjoyed quiet mornings with tea, sitting by a window with his guitar resting nearby. He reportedly loved animals, often surrounding himself with dogs that gave him comfort no tabloid could provide. He had a playful streak too, delighting in practical jokes, small surprises, and spontaneous laughter. But here's where it gets complicated. Andy also longed for stability in relationships, something that fame made elusive. His highly publicized romance with actress Victoria Principal was one of the most discussed celebrity pairings of the early 1980s. The two seemed destined for fairy tale headlines: handsome pop star and glamorous actress, both adored by fans. But the reality was more fragile. Conflicting schedules, pressure from the spotlight, and Andy's personal struggles reportedly created cracks in the relationship. When it ended, Andy was devastated. Friends say it left a void that deepened his sense of isolation. Still, Andy never stopped seeking love and connection. He cherished time with his daughter, Peta, born in 1978 from his marriage to Kim Reeder. Though the relationship with Kim ended, Andy spoke often about wanting to be a good father, even when distance and circumstances complicated that desire. He adored her, one family friend recalled. Even when he couldn't be present in the way he wanted, she was always in his heart. Now, if you're wondering how his values compared to his older brothers, the differences are telling. Barry, Robin, and Maurice were disciplined craftsmen, often described as workaholics who could spend endless hours perfecting a single chord progression. Andy, by contrast, valued immediacy. He wanted songs that felt alive in the moment, not endlessly reworked. He believed music should flow, not be strangled by overthinking. This philosophy reflected his personality: spontaneous, emotional, open. It made his performances magnetic, but it also left him vulnerable in an industry that demands relentless discipline. And that's when everything changed. In his final years, stripped of the frenzy of fame, Andy's values crystallized. Friends recall him prioritizing family dinners, conversations with his mother, and walks in the English countryside. He spoke less about chart positions and more about personal peace. He just wanted to be loved for who he was, Barry later admitted. These values, simplicity, connection, honesty, were what defined Andy when the noise of the industry fell away. It's what those closest to him remember most, not the strobe lights, not the screaming crowds, but the boy who once watched his brothers rehearse in a small Queensland home, dreaming only of music and belonging. Barry, reflecting decades later, often returns to that memory. He emphasizes that Andy was not a tragedy, not a rumor, but a human being full of love and longing. "He was my little brother," Barry has said, his voice breaking even after all these years. And he deserved to be remembered as more than the headlines. To understand Andy Gibb's story fully, we have to talk about the environment he inhabited, the world of late 1970s and early 1980s pop culture. It wasn't just glamorous stages and screaming fans. It was also contracts, producers, and television cameras that demanded consistency Andy often couldn't give. Take the show Solid Gold. At first glance, it looked like an easy job. Stand under the lights, introduce acts, maybe perform a song of your own. But the reality was punishing. Call times began at dawn. Scripts were rewritten minutes before taping. Camera rehearsals stretched on for hours. Stars were expected to smile through exhaustion, to sell a mood that was rehearsed yet effortless. Now, if you're wondering why critics seemed so harsh on Andy, the answer lies in that system. The television machine doesn't forgive stumbles. When Andy faltered, missing cues, appearing distracted. Critics pounced. Articles framed him as unprofessional, sometimes even lazy. What they missed was the deeper truth. Andy was battling private struggles while trying to meet impossible standards. But here's where it gets complicated. The entertainment industry thrives on appearances. Networks and record labels were quick to celebrate Andy's success when his singles topped charts, but equally quick to distance themselves when his reliability was questioned. The same tabloids that once called him the next superstar soon ran headlines painting him as washed up before he even turned 25. For Andy, that scrutiny was devastating. Unlike his older brothers who had weathered decades of ups and downs together as a unit, Andy was largely on his own. The Bee Gees' collective identity shielded them from total collapse. Andy had no such shield. Every mistake was his alone. And that's when everything changed. The criticism began shaping public perception. Fans still adored him, but the industry grew wary. Offers slowed. Budgets tightened. The very machine that had lifted him now seemed to push him aside. And yet, through it all, Andy still tried to deliver. He recorded singles, made television appearances, even performed at charity events. The resilience was there, but the pressure was crushing. Barry has spoken about this dynamic with remarkable honesty. "People don't see what goes on behind the curtain," he explained. "They see the lights, but they don't see the toll." His words reveal a larger truth about television and music at the time. It was less about artistry and more about relentless image maintenance. For someone as emotionally open as Andy, that world was nearly impossible to survive in. Decades later, the questions remain. How does Barry Gibb, at 78, live with the memory of Andy's struggles? What has he chosen to confirm, and what does he still hold close to his heart? The answer is layered. Today, Barry is recognized as one of the most enduring figures in modern music. He is the last surviving Gibb brother, a living link to an era when the Bee Gees' falsetto-driven anthems dominated the globe. But when he speaks of legacy, he rarely talks about numbers or sales. He talks about family, and inevitably, about Andy. Now, if you're wondering how Barry has addressed the rumors directly, he has done so with careful clarity. In interviews, he has confirmed that Andy's final days were shaped by fragile health, by loneliness, and by a heart condition that ultimately took his life. He has dispelled the harsher myths, that Andy's death was a deliberate act, or that drugs alone defined his final chapter. "He was ill," Barry said plainly, "and his heart gave out. That's the truth." But here's where it gets complicated. Barry also admits that the family dynamic was difficult. They loved Andy, but they struggled to help him in ways that would last. "We tried everything," Barry confessed, "but sometimes love isn't enough." It is a sentence that weighs heavy even decades later, a reminder that behind the music are human bonds, messy and imperfect. In terms of where Barry himself stands now, his life is quieter, more reflective. He continues to perform occasionally, often dedicating songs to his brothers. Fans who have attended his shows in recent years describe emotional moments when Barry pauses mid-set, speaking softly about Andy. "I still feel him with me," he has said on stage. At 78, Barry spends more time with his family in Miami, valuing privacy after a lifetime of public exposure. He has embraced his role as elder statesman of pop, appearing in documentaries and interviews, but always with a note of humility. When asked about Andy, he doesn't shy away anymore. Instead, he confirms the reality. Andy's story was tragic, yes, but it was also full of light. And that's when everything changed. By choosing to speak openly, Barry has reframed Andy's narrative. Instead of rumors dictating the memory, Barry's words now shape it. He ensures that Andy is remembered not just for struggle, but for talent, for love, and for the brief brilliance of his career. For fans, this confirmation has been both heartbreaking and healing. Heartbreaking because it closes the door on hopeful speculation that Andy might have overcome his struggles if given more time. Healing because it finally restores dignity to a story long twisted by gossip. Today, Barry carries the weight of legacy, not only his own, but his brother's. When he looks back, he sees more than hit records. He sees a family that tried, stumbled, loved, and ultimately endured through music. And in speaking now at 78, he gives Andy what rumor never could, the truth, spoken by the brother who loved him most. For all the rumors, the criticisms, and the tragedy of Andy Gibb's short life, there remains one thing that never faded, the way fans remember him. Close your eyes and picture a concert hall in 1978. The lights, dim. A crowd of teenagers surges forward, screaming in anticipation. Then Andy steps out, guitar in hand, his smile radiant. When he begins to sing Shadow Dancing, the noise from the audience nearly drowns out his voice. Girls faint, boys look on with envy. Parents who had come reluctantly find themselves tapping their feet despite themselves. Now, if you're wondering why the memory of Andy still holds power, it's because of moments like these. His music captured the spirit of a generation poised between disco's fever and the soft rock wave that followed. Songs like I Just Want to Be Your Everything weren't just hits. They were soundtracks to first dances, to summer romances, to nights when the future felt wide open. Fans remember more than the songs. They remember Andy himself, approachable, warm, and slightly shy despite his fame. At autograph signings, he reportedly lingered with each fan, asking names, offering small jokes. He made you feel seen, one admirer wrote years later. That quality, rare in celebrity culture, created bonds that outlasted the charts. But here's where it gets complicated. The very qualities that made Andy beloved also magnified the pain of losing him so young. For fans who had grown up with his music, his death felt personal, like losing a friend. Letters poured into magazines, memorials bloomed outside recording studios, and radio stations played his songs on repeat. In those days before the internet, grief spread through word of mouth, through mixtapes, through whispered conversations among classmates. Barry has acknowledged this fan devotion many times. People never forgot Andy, he said. They kept him alive in their hearts. That enduring impact is perhaps the clearest proof that Andy's story was never just about tragedy. It was about connection. Even today, younger listeners discovering his music through streaming platforms leave comments that echo the sentiments of 1978. Why did he have to go so soon? This song feels like it was written for me. Andy's reach extends across decades, reminding us that genuine vulnerability in music never loses relevance. So what, in the end, is Andy Gibb's legacy? And how has Barry's confirmation at 78 reshaped it? The answer lies in the arc of his life. Andy was a comet, brilliant, fast, and fleeting. His career burned brightly with chart-topping hits, but the pressures of fame, health, and personal struggles dimmed that light far too soon. Yet in that short time, he carved out a space in pop history that remains unique. His legacy is twofold. Musically, he proved that vulnerability could be a form of strength. At a time when pop often leaned on bravado or spectacle, Andy offered sincerity. He sang love songs that didn't hide behind metaphor, and fans felt every word. His voice, smooth and youthful, remains one of the most distinctive of his era. Personally, his legacy is even deeper. By confirming the truth about Andy's final days, Barry reframed his brother's story not as scandal, but as a lesson in fragility and compassion. He died of a broken heart, Barry once said. It is both poetic and painfully literal, a line that ensures Andy is remembered not as a tabloid cautionary tale, but as a human being overwhelmed by forces too great to bear. And that's when everything changed. With Barry's words, the rumors gave way to dignity. Andy's memory is now safeguarded by love rather than speculation. His legacy reminds us that fame can magnify both beauty and pain. but that the true measure of a life is the love it leaves behind. If we return to the beginning, to that small home in Queensland, where the Gibb children learned music around the dinner table, we see the full circle. Back then, music was about family, about harmonies woven together in the heat of an Australian evening. Decades later, after global fame and heartbreaking loss, Barry confirms that at its core, Andy's story was still about family. It began with love, and it ends with love. At 78, Barry Gibb has chosen to open his heart, confirming the truth about Andy's final days, not to feed gossip, not to relive pain, but to honor his little brother's memory, to set the record straight with dignity and compassion. Andy Gibb's life was short, but it was radiant. His music still plays, his smile still lingers in photographs, and through Barry's words, his humanity, fragile, beautiful, imperfect, remains alive. If you've followed Andy, share a memory or lesson he taught you. Be kind in the comments. And if you want more thoughtful tributes like this, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.